Roads University, it's really important that we do an acknowledgement of traditional lands. And Royal Roads University, we acknowledge that the campus is located on the traditional lands of the Kosetsum, Esquimalt, and Lekwungen Songhees ancestors and families who have lived here for thousands of years. This land has been a part of the fabric of the life of Indigenous communities long before Hatley Castle was built, and it will be long into the future. It is with gratitude that we now learn and work here, where the past, present, and future of Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, faculty, and staff come together. This is something that I've been personally reflecting on a lot when I walk around campus. I'm working from home, but when I'm on campus, walking down Charlie's Trail or looking out at the Esquimalt Lagoon, this is something that I think about and I reflect on. And I'm really looking forward to today's session where we explore the shared responsibility of reconciliation. And now that's the end of the PowerPoint part of our presentation. Now, if everybody's ready, we're going to launch into a really quick poll. Are you ready? It's kind of a ready, set, go. So the first question that we really want to get to know you. We want to know who's in the room today. And so you can see the poll here on the screen. If you can select what you most identify with, and you can actually select more than one option. So please let me know what you identify most with. And if you don't see something in the poll that you would really have preferred to see there, comment in the chat so we can make sure to add it next time. Awesome, the polls are active. Okay, I'm going to give it another 10 or 15 seconds. Wow, that is a diverse group of a lot of different people from a lot of different areas. That's wonderful to see. Okay, I'm going to end the polling. So if you're about to click now. Okay, here are the results so that everybody can see them. Okay, we have some alumni in the room. We have some students. We have some Rhodes faculty and staff, people who work in government. Oh, I think you won the poll with 31%. Work in not-profit, work in business, First Nation, community member, and none of the above apply to me. Okay, for those, please comment in the chat. Awesome. And then one more poll before I hand it over to our speakers today. The next poll that we want to know about is, let me see here. Do you work in the field of Indigenous relations? So the question is, do you work in the field of Indigenous relations? And you have yes, no, or no, but I want to. Okay, I'll give that another 20 seconds. All right, 10 more seconds. Click now or forever. Awesome. Okay, we're going to end the polling and I will share the results so we can all see them. Okay, so the question is, do you work in the field of Indigenous relations? And 30% said yes, 53% said no, and 17% said no, but I want to. Awesome. Thank you so much for participating in that poll. This is really valuable information. And I know Hope and Charles were really wanting to know who's in the room today and a bit more about you. And with that, I would love to introduce Charles Krusekopf, who will be introducing himself as well as our speaker, Hope Sanderson. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. And we were having there's a discussion in the chat, and I appreciate it because I believe it's very true. And it's really the core topic that we're talking about today in terms of reconciliation. We're all in the business of building reconciliation, and we're all in the business of Indigenous relations in a way, because I myself am the program head of the MBA program here at Royal Roads and a settler on these territories. I came originally from what is the territory of Texas in the US and moved here to these beautiful, beautiful lands and have been so blessed to have been welcomed here. And so it's been part of my own learning journey, which really is just starting, and getting to know people like Hope Sanderson, who is an MBA alum from Royal Roads, and who is working with me and with us on some programming as we develop in terms of Indigenous relations, and we're working. I saw someone from the Haisla territories writing in, and we're working together with Haisla First Nation on some new educational opportunities, and quite excited about that. And so I've gotten to know Hope because she is working with us, and she has a tremendous amount of experience. She has more than 30 years of experience working in the energy industry. She says mostly in the pipeline field and across working with stakeholders, working with Indigenous communities, working with government in a variety of different roles and tasks. And she really highlights that she is a mediator, she's a negotiator, she's someone who works with people on a whole wide variety of problems. Hope herself is Métis and actively engaged with the Métis community and other Indigenous communities across Canada. And she recently completed her doctorate from SMC University in Switzerland. And her focus there was on the water crisis and the water issue in First Nations across Canada. And I believe Hope is going to be talking with us about that topic and reconciliation and this journey we're all taking together. So Hope, I turn it over to you for your personal introduction and storytelling.
Thanks, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Are we good, Andrea? Can you hear me? Thumbs up. Awesome, thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. I come to you today. I might be the only Albertan, I'm not sure because I couldn't see the polling. I come to you from the traditional land and ancestral lands of the treaties of the nations of Treaty 7, which are the Siksika, the Piikani, Kainai, Tsuut'ina nations, as well as the Stoney Nakoda nations, and my own nation, the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. And this is part of our traditional territory. And as a matter of fact, several years ago, probably 2014, 2015, I conducted a traditional land use study for my nation in southeastern Alberta and southwestern Saskatchewan. I'll talk about that a little bit later when it gets into how do you put reconciliation into action. And yes, I've been working for a very long time trying to build bridges between our communities and have had a lot of success, a lot of challenges, some failures, and you learn from them all. But before we really get into this, this is a topic that is emotional and it's spiritual. And sometimes it can even be physical, as we saw about this time last year with the Wet'suwet'en protests against the Coastal GasLink pipeline. So in light of that, I would like to just very briefly acknowledge the presence of our Creator in our virtual room today, and to ask the Creator for guidance and to give us an open mind today to think critically and to think with our hearts as well as our heads. And that's a typical way that we would open a lot of meetings. Some people would say it in their own language. I'm not fluent in Cree, which is my Indigenous language, but I can get by. And I know when people are talking about me. So welcome, everyone. The order of things today I thought we'd go through is I want to talk a little bit about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the calls to action. And I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that. I did send Charles and Imera a list of references that we can send out afterwards. That might be useful for you. I'll talk a little bit about my research, my PhD research, that was on basically, as Charles mentioned, it was on the water issues that are plaguing First Nations in Canada that we've seen in the news for years. And unfortunately, the media isn't changing a lot on that topic, and I'll talk a little bit about why. I'll talk a little bit as well about my years in industry. I've worked, as Charles also noted, I've worked most of my career in the oil and gas business. I have worked in the nonprofit sector for the RCMP as the CEO of their national charity a few years ago, and did a lot of focus on Indigenous youth crime prevention. And I've also worked in post-secondary. And so I'll talk a little bit mostly about resource development and reconciliation, because that's what I'm strongest with, on relationship building and leveling the playing field. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about, so what are the solutions to the water problem, and maybe draw some parallels into other parts of your world. And that's why I wanted to know what parts of the workforce you were coming from, whether you were with nonprofit or government or Indigenous communities. And because the solutions need to be everywhere, and they need to start with every person, is my personal belief. And then we can move to some questions. So I think, Imera, you're going to leave questions, and Charles, you're going to leave questions till the end, right? Or people can pose questions in the chat room. And I also did I want to thank folks who sent in their questions in advance. I took a look at those and did my best to sort of put some answers together for you. So without any further, let's just get on with about the TRC, because that really is the catalyst that got us going into the policy that has been developed around reconciliation by the federal government and several provincial governments. And so the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it was something that was put into place, but what needed to happen before you can put a Truth and Reconciliation Commission into place is you need to have a recognition and an admission. And that's what Prime Minister Stephen Harper did in I think he did it in 2014. And so he issued the federal government's apology for the Indian residential schools. And you'll hear me use the word Indian a few times throughout the presentation. Indian is still a legal, valid word. It is not the preferred word, but sometimes I need to use that word for context. And I have a whole chapter in my PhD around nomenclature within our community, because it's evolved so much over the years. It used to be my first business card, which I still have from when I worked in this field, says Native Affairs, believe it or not. So they were called the Indian residential schools, and so that's why I'm using that word. I'm not using it, I'm using it in a legal fashion, because there is still an Indian Act in place, and there are still legally and constitutionally referred to as Indian reserves. So please don't take offense when I use that word, because I'm using it on purpose to draw a point sometimes, but also for the legal context. And the apology was also a follow-up to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1996. And there was a panel put together for that commission, and Dr. Peter Meekison was a member of that panel. And I remember bringing him to my company in 1997 to give a presentation on their work. And so you think about that. That was a long time ago, right? And I wanted him to come and talk about, we didn't talk about it as reconciliation back in those days. It was just at the beginning of the acknowledgement of the injustices. So this started a long time ago, and the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which there's another term, Aboriginal, that is sort of outdated now, but it is still a legal term because it's also still in our Constitution. It had 227 recommendations. And if we advance to 2021, and if you go back and look at those 227 recommendations, how many actually have been implemented? And then you fast forward to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its 94 calls to action, which are basically stronger verbiage and language than just the recommendations that came out of the RCAP. And just for a little bit of trivia or knowledge and awareness, RCAP, which is referred to commonly in our community, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, was the largest and most expensive and most expansive Royal Commission that has ever been undertaken in Canada. And it's because of the scope that they had to study from coast to coast to coast. And it also was based on the Indian residential schools and trying to understand the intergenerational trauma that resulted from the Indian residential schools. And I want to clarify as well that the Indian residential schools, it wasn't just for the Indians. The Inuit and the Métis were also in the residential schools. And I remember when I was working with ConocoPhillips in the Arctic, we were trying to I was leading a team engaged on consultation and engagement on the Mackenzie Valley pipeline. And the company that I was working for was going to drill the wells for the gas between Inuvik and Tuktoyaktuk. So I spent a lot of time in Tuk, we call it Tuk affectionately. And there's a boat that sits on a hill, almost like a monument in the middle of town. And it's not a big town. There's only 800 people who live there. And it's on the very tip of the Arctic. It's right on the Arctic Ocean. And there's this boat, and it's old. It's from probably the 40s, 50s, 60s, 50s probably. And when you start talking to people in the community, you ask about what that boat is and why it's there. And that was the boat that came to get the kids, to take them away to residential school. And that boat remains there as a reminder that no more will they take our children away. And another little simple analogy to set the, or emotional analogy, I guess I would say, to set the context for why reconciliation is, I remember when I was working in southern BC on another pipeline for TransCanada Pipelines, and I was working with the ACAM, which is formerly known as St. Mary's Band at Cranbrook. And I remember being invited to community meetings, and there was an old residential school on the reserve, and it's right outside of Cranbrook, so they really are very integrated. But they were at a point where they were doing some significant economic development, which I'm going to talk a little bit about later as well. And Chief Sophie Pierre was the chief at the time, and she wanted to build a golf course, world-class golf course, and she wanted to build a hotel. And so the community discussions were around what to do with the residential school. And it went on for months. And so every time I happened to be down in Cranbrook, if there was a community meeting going on, I was invited because I was a welcomed community partner. And you know, I sat in those community meetings, and I probably went to 3. And on the third one, there was probably many that I didn't go to, but on the third one that I attended, this old woman, and old woman is an affectionate term in Indian languages. I'll call her Kukum because that's the Cree word for grandmother. This Kukum stood up and she just went, enough, because there had been so much emotion and so many meetings and so much anger coming out of the community, which was necessary. And she got to a point, and they're not a matriarchal community, but she got to a point where she said, and this is what she said, enough bad has come out of that place for too long. About time some good comes out of it. Build the hotel in the school. And they did. And I don't know if you've ever been to Akam, but that hotel is beautiful. And the last time I was there was a couple of years ago as part of my PhD research. And if you're there for a formal meeting that's hosted by the nation, they give you a tour of the residential school, and they take you back in time, and this is from the residential school survivors from that community, and they take you back in time, and they talk to you about, this is the stairwell that I had to scrub on my hands and knees until my knuckles bled with a toothbrush, and then if it wasn't clean enough, how my knuckles got wrapped while they were still bleeding by the nuns. And so it brings the emotion and the past to the very present. And that's why we needed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And that's why we needed a reconciliation policy by the federal government. And that's why we need to adopt the principles of UNDRIP in this country. We need to get rid of the injustices of the past. And we're getting there. We're just starting. So I want to talk a little bit about that today. Is that reconciliation is not new to us. As many of you know, there have been reconciliation commissions in Rwanda, Uganda, Germany after World War II, Yugoslavia, and Haiti even after Papa Doc and Baby Doc's tenures there. And so there's 94 calls to action that came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And what I want to say is truth is about the past and admitting the injustices of the past. You can't move forward until you admit something's wrong and you take accountability for it. And I think this government is really doing that, this federal government, and they're doing it in so many ways. And what I want to talk about here today, when we get closer to, when I get past this part, is what can we all do about this, on this shared journey towards reconciliation, because we can't get there unless everyone's on board. And we'll never get 100%, but I think we need a groundswell. And I think that groundswell is starting. And I think it's starting much stronger in BC, particularly because BC passed UNDRIP legislation a year ago, November. And they're starting to put that into place. And they're starting to put it into place from looking at it from a land use perspective and the sharing of the land. And recognizing the inherent rights and things that go along with that. But so the truth piece is, I think, about the past and even about the present, because there's still injustices in place today by policy, by government policy, and by practice, by everyone. And sometimes they're unconscious injustices. And so we can draw that out a little bit today, maybe pull on that thread a little bit. And I think reconciliation really is about the present and the future. So we've admitted the injustices of the past, maybe not all of them, but we'll get there and we'll deal with the ones that really need to be dealt with. And I think that we're starting to do that. You know, what's interesting is that it was originally about the Indian residential schools, the TRC and the apology, but reconciliation is much, much bigger than that. It's about just about everything that impacts Indigenous people's lives that is controlled by government policy and government funding. And I'm going to get into that a little bit as well. It's much bigger than that. I mean, when I talk about reconciliations about the present and the future, I mean, things like, I used to be on the board of Child and Family Services here in Alberta. I was appointed by the minister to be the Indigenous board member. And one of the things that we sometimes had to do was take kids away from their family. And so there's the past, you know, rolling forward right into your face in your future. And so one of the things my other fellow Indigenous board members and I did was we created a paradigm shift within the government that if we're taking kids away from their parents, Indigenous kids away from their parents and their families, for whatever justifiable reasons that was deemed for them to be taken away, and sometimes it was very justifiable, most of the time it was, that we put support mechanisms in place to keep those kids connected to their culture, and that there is a joint decision-making process on how to handle the return of the care for those children while they're in care, but also their return to their family, and creating supports for the family to be able to be better parents and give the children what they need so that we didn't have to take them away again. And I tell you, that was several years ago, and we made some good progress. But today, there are still more Indigenous kids in government care today than there were when all of the residential schools were in full force. Something's still wrong, right? There's more kids in government custody today in Canada than when the residential schools were in full force. We got to change this. And that's just one of the calls to action, is around children and families, right? There's 94 of them. So there's so many things that need to change, and we've got lots of time to do it. Some things need to be done faster and sooner than others. And I think what I want to transition to later is what does reconciliation really mean? And what does it mean when you internalize it and you personalize it, whether you're an Indigenous person or not? And one of the things that's really hard for people to understand, especially non-Indigenous Canadians, whether they're Canadians that have been here for multiple generations or whether they're new Canadians, is why can't the Indians just get on with it? Like, get over it and get on with it, right? That was a long time ago, get over it. I think I've given you some examples, very recent examples, of why we can't get over it. We're trying, but you got to get some barriers out of the way first. And we as a nation, whether it's a First Nation, a Métis Nation, or the Inuit Nation, we want to be the architects of our future, because we certainly were not the architects of our past once colonialism took hold. And, I mean, for example, how many other pieces of race-based legislation are there in Canada right now? None. There is only one piece of legislation in this country that is based on race, and that's the Indian Act. And it governs the daily lives of all First Nations. and to some degree in the Inuit in the north. The Métis is not covered under that, but they're starting to talk about the equivalency from the Daniels case. It was a Supreme Court case that we won as a Métis nation, establishing that the government has the same responsibilities legally to us Métis as they do the First Nations. So I set a little bit of a table for you here. Charles, you were going to jump in, I think.
Yeah, well, it's just there's a number of questions coming up. One of them, because I thought this is important, the overall, and we talked some about this, about the term reconciliation and the meaning of the term reconciliation, or how reconciliation, I guess, is interpreted or by different people and in different contexts. And so maybe speaking a little bit about that. Another question was around the implementation of some of the TRC's recommendations and calls for action. And the specific question was around that only a small number of the 94 have been addressed. And so a couple of areas that seemed pertinent to what you're talking about. And there's a lot of questions, and we'll come back around to some of those later, but I just thought I would pose those two.
Okay, that's good. Perfect timing. I was just moving to that in my notes about what is reconciliation. And what's interesting, I think, and I've given this talk on reconciliation several times since the report came out, to different groups. The United Church of Canada, I've engaged with them and involved in their right relations circle, and it means something different. And which was the first church, by the way, to apologize for the Indian residential schools. And I've given it to Association of Fundraising Professionals. I've given it in companies and nonprofits, and it's the definition of reconciliation, I think, is very personal. I mean, the government has a policy on reconciliation and how it wants to achieve things. For me personally, and I think this is consistent with what I heard and experienced with other Indigenous peoples that I've engaged with, reconciliation is about getting to equality. Once we reconcile the injustices of the past, we will know that we have done that, because there is no more inequalities in whether you're Indigenous or not. And I think that is one objective and one definition of reconciliation. And I think the first part, as I mentioned earlier, is really the admissions piece and acknowledging that those things happened, and let's get on with it. And so every nation is going to put their reconciliation objectives and priorities forward before governments, before business, and before anybody who wants to engage and work with them and walk their moccasins on their territory. And we're starting to see that being asserted and enforced in a lot of different ways. So I think really it's very personal. It's very diverse, because it touches so many things. This is just not about the residential schools and the impacts and the intergenerational trauma that those left. This is about access to safe drinking water. There's an inequality. That's my area that I studied, that I think is a fundamental inequality that needs to be resolved. It needs to be a priority. And you do see it as a priority in the federal government. How about implementation of priorities? So I'll transition to that next. I'll use that as a segue to the next question. So 94 calls to action, lots of work to do, lots of Indigenous peoples with lots of different priorities around those calls to action. Many of the national bodies, such as the Assembly of First Nations, the Métis National Council, the Inuit Tupirit, and then the provincial bodies associated with each of those, because each of those have their regional bodies, have internalized what reconciliation means to them and prioritized it, and are working with the governments at various levels, also within their own governments, because let's face it, they are governmental bodies, whether people want to recognize that or not. There's a personal attitude check with people. What do we really recognize Indigenous governments as governments, and their assertion and insistence that it be nation to nation. And so there is that paradigm in our community. We're a nation and we need to be treated as such. I'm going to get into that a little bit later. The implementation piece, that is, I think, a part where if you have an interest in any of the calls to action, get involved, get engaged, find a way. For me, it was around the water piece, and it was around doing traditional land use work to establish territory, particularly for the Métis, who have had a totally different history in being recognized by the federal government and even provincial governments on our rights and our occupancy and the tenure of our occupancy on the land in Western Canada in particular. And so the implementation is going to take a long time. And on some of the calls to action, we'll start to see more resolution and change getting into place. Remember, I said earlier, after RCAP in 1996, there were 227 recommendations. Many of them have fallen by the wayside. Some of them got implemented. Change is happening. I think that the pendulum on change has been very slow. And then recently there's been a knee-jerk, and the pendulum's at a far end right now, and it's going to start to swing back. And then there'll be things that'll force it back to the other end, like more water crises, like more national blockades of infrastructure, stopping the trains in Eastern Canada in support of the Wet'suwet'en in Northern BC, that sort of thing. Those will be signals that we're not there, we're not getting there fast enough, and people are not being heard, and implementation is not taking place fast enough. And I think until we start to get more resolution on the implementation, we start to see more change really taking hold. You'll see implementation that's the way bureaucracies work. It's a government bureaucracy. I think the nations are trying to kickstart it as much as possible everywhere they can. I mean, I recently was working on the Trans Mountain Expansion Project, and I worked with over 150 nations for the last few years. And I didn't go to a meeting where there wasn't reconciliation and UNDRIP brought to the table until asking me and my team, how are you going to respond with this pipeline and everything that you're doing to achieve reconciliation on our lands and with us? And so it's very prevalent. So I am more hopeful now than I have ever been in my entire life as a Métis person or as a professional working in this field than I ever have in the last 30 years. I'm much more hopeful. And I think because there's a bit of a groundswell. And I think it started, quite honestly, with the hunger strike by the chief from Attawapiskat quite a few years ago. And what was the movement? I can't remember it now. Where everybody camped out across the country. It was a very powerful movement. I'm embarrassed that I forgot it. No. Anyways, I think you all know what I'm talking about. It's back about 6 years ago.
I don't know more. I don't know more.
I don't know more. Sorry, I knew there was a no in there. There's always a no in our community. Thank you. That was real. And you know what really helped it? That started with 2 women in Saskatchewan on social media. And that took on a groundswell across the country. And that was powerful because our community got a hold of social media, right? And used it very effectively. And it wasn't about the chief's hunger strike. She kind of piggybacked on that. And good for her. But it was almost, you could have called it enough is enough already. Or you could have called it the start of reconciliation. So I think implementation is going to take a long time, but I think we're on the right path. And I think there's certain things that are going to speed it up from time to time. I hope that helps. Let's see, I'll talk to you a little bit about my water work a little bit. And then I think we're probably getting to a point where we should probably open it up for maybe a Q&A. I don't know how you want to handle that, but my water work or my PhD research was on really around governance. And it was the governance of the provision of safe drinking water and trying to look at it as to why First Nations didn't have access to safe drinking water consistently across the country. And other Canadians did, because my goodness, I was thinking, this can't be a technical problem, because if it was technical, nobody in Canada would have safe drinking water. So it's not a technical problem. And I did prove that in my research. And it's interesting. There was an Auditor General report that came out on February 25th, just about 3 weeks ago. So the AG has been following this problem for years. And so has the United Nations, as a matter of fact. And I can send some resources on that if they aren't already in my references that I sent you or links that I sent you, Charles. But I wanted to look at it because it was an inequality, it was an injustice, and we had a mandate for reconciliation in 2016 when the Prime Minister took office, and that was one of the things he campaigned on, was getting rid of the boil water advisories and the drinking water advisories in First Nations. So when I started my research in my field work in 2016, there were 136 drinking water advisories on 92 First Nations in Canada. And that was not, so at the time it was reported by Health Canada, and Health Canada didn't look at anything north of 60, and they didn't look at BC. So if you eliminate all of those, 92 First Nations that they were actually reporting on, the number was likely much, much higher. Today, I think the government's made a lot of progress in addressing some of the long-term water issues, but I'm skeptical of their reporting, and only because I'll give you one example. One of the communities that I studied, and I studied 2 Mohawk communities, one in Ontario, one in Quebec. And I chose 2 just to make my PhD harder. I chose them because they were not remote and they had strong economic development, and they were very mainstream. They were in the middle of other mainstream communities adjacent to, much as you would see Musqueam to Vancouver, for example. And so I wanted to study if it was a remote and a northern issue, right? Nope, not at all. And so one of the communities that I studied, it took them 25 years to get approval for infrastructure funding for a water treatment plant. 25 years. They have documented all the studies and the money that they spent individually as a community to prove the need for a water treatment plant. And when they got the funding, they got $30 million. And the $30 million connected 75 homes, the band office, the school, and the health center. The rest of the community still on contaminated wells that are not fit for human consumption. So now the government says, we gave you the money, you built the water treatment plant, we're taking you off the boil water advisory or the no drinking water advisory. So I'm a little bit skeptical of the government reporting when they take that community off because they gave them a water treatment plant that serves a fraction of the community. A little bit skeptical. So, and I'm a little bit skeptical in the reporting has changed. It used to be Health Canada that reported it. Now it's Indigenous Services Canada. So from an academic perspective, as an academic, I have to really kind of poke the bear on that and say that's a little bit self-serving. So that's why I'm glad that there's an Auditor General who keeps looking into that. So the most recent Auditor General's report from February of this year says, you're making progress, but you're not there. And you need to pull up your socks and improve your commitment to end these and to end them permanently, and you need to fund them properly. And in my research, there was 3 or 4 major contributing factors to the water problem. I was really, really, really happy to see the Auditor General came out with almost all the same findings. So I guess I can publish now, Charles. So anyways, and it really did come down to funding. And let me draw you an interesting analogy to bring it back to reconciliation. So basically what my research said, and I've seen in the literature, in my literature reviews, and in other government documentation, it would probably cost about $5 billion to get all First Nations off of permanent drinking water advisories. $5 billion, okay? So in response to the Auditor General's findings, because they have their findings and the department has to respond, it says, yes, we agree, we're committing $309 million this year. It's a little short. You're about 4.5 short. So on the flip side, when I started working on the Trans Mountain Expansion Project was around the time that the federal government bought Trans Mountain, and they paid $4.5 billion for Trans Mountain. And their justification for it was that it was in the national interest because Kinder Morgan had basically said it was going to cancel the project and the expansion project. And the federal government didn't want that. They wanted their resources to get to Tidewater. Whether you agree with Trans Mountain and the expansion project and the use of hydrocarbons, let's leave that aside. the demand is there, and the federal government saw it in the national interest of Canadians to acquire Trans Mountain and to build the expansion project. It spent $5 billion to buy Trans Mountain, $4.5 billion, knowing that the expansion project was also going to cost $7.5 billion, because it was in the national interest. Is safe drinking water not in the national interest for First Nations and worth spending $5 billion? Let's look at reconciliation and the inequities and how it's applied, right? And so calls to action, safe drinking water, they're trying to get there. They've made some progress, because right now I think there's 60 long-term. So 6 years ago when I started my research, there were 136, now there's 60. So, you know, but he made a promise by March 31st this month, they would all be gone. They won't all be gone. And I don't think they'll all be permanently gone either, but it looks really good in the numbers as a politician going into an election to have those kind of numbers as well, let's face it, right? And so they're making progress, but it's about what some of the chiefs say to me, putting your money where your mouth is, right? And do it now. And that's actually what the Auditor General said. So some of the solutions are around things like what I said in my research, and I was able to draw some light on, is that there was First Nations are federal jurisdiction, water is provincial. So there's a provincial jurisdiction, or there's a jurisdictional quagmire that First Nations get caught in. For any of you who have worked in First Nations or in nonprofit, you'll know of, and maybe for other reasons, you'll know of the Jordan's rule, right? The Jordan's principle. That poor kid got caught in the jurisdictional quagmire of whose responsibility was it to fund the services that this kid needed. And now we've got Jordan's rule. Now we need that was an individual, a family scenario. The water one is sort of Jordan's rule on a national scale. Let's get the jurisdiction sorted out. Let's get the bureaucracy sorted out. So how I can transition some of the findings from my research to reconciliation is around personalizing it and looking at what we do in each of our own organizations. And I consult to a lot of organizations to go in and do assessments of policies, procedures, practices. Are they barriers? Can you indigenize them? I did a big project for TransCanada Pipelines quite a few years ago, and I looked at every policy and procedure and practice within the organization, assessed it to see if there were any racial barriers to recruiting. Recruiting Indigenous people into organizations can often be very difficult, and there's lots of factors and criteria that can help improve your attraction rates. And so organizations can look at things like assessing their attractiveness to Indigenous people, if they value having Indigenous people working in their workforces, and the Indigenous knowledge and different, we call it ways of knowing, Indigenous ways of knowing, and incorporating that into your organizations. Royal Roads is a perfect example, how we opened up this meeting today in applying the acknowledgement and starting to weave indigeneity into different policies and practices and in their programs and in how they engage with their Indigenous neighbors and partners, such as Charles mentioned around the partnership with Heisla. You know, it's looking at your own personal attitudes. I'm going to give you one little story, and I think then we can turn it over to discussion. Looking at personal attitudes. I mean, if you look at me, I don't look Indigenous. To non-Indigenous people, I don't look Indigenous. But to Indigenous people, they automatically assume that I am. And because Indigenous has a different face across the country. And so a few years ago, I was invited, a group of very prominent women in Toronto invited me to lunch because they knew I was working on the water problem. And I sat down and one of them said to me, well, let me back up a little bit. So a little bit about me that wasn't in my bio. You know, I've got now 3 degrees. I've worked in oil and gas business for 30 years. I compete in Ironman triathlon. I've got 5 Ironmans under my belt. You know, I was a national team swimmer. And so I've had a fairly accomplished life. Got a BA, MBA, I've got a degree in negotiation or diploma in negotiation from Harvard. MIT, I've got my Royal Roads MBA, now I've got a PhD. And this one woman said to me, "Oh my God, you're so accomplished for an Indigenous woman." And I said, "I'm accomplished for an Indigenous woman? I think I'm pretty freaking accomplished for any Canadian. Why put me in that category?" And this is the anger that you start to see coming out when Indigenous people are put into boxes and they're kept there, right? We do everything we can to overcome and become equal and become, step ourselves up, and we're still put back there. And that's where a lot of the anger comes from. One of the things that I want you to acknowledge when you're working with Indigenous people, the barriers and the anger are there and they're coming from somewhere. But once you get behind them, you have to be patient and get behind them. And man, that's when you can really start to do the great work. And this woman continued on and said she was trying to figure out something, right? And so I went with it. And later on in the lunch, she learned that my mother wasn't Indigenous and that it was my father who was Indigenous. And she went, "Oh, that's why you're so accomplished, because your mother wasn't Indigenous." And I just went, I have a lot of Indigenous friends who have Indigenous mothers, and they're very accomplished as well. Like, so I was checking her attitudes here, right? So I think that's where you start, is with yourself and calling behaviors and attitudes and having the courage to do it when you see it and hear it, no matter where you are. And that's the start, because that's where all starts with us. Every individual person has to own a piece of this, because until we start to break down those barriers and those attitudes, to even somebody like me, I'm not somebody who comes from a remote reserve with a heavy accent, right? I speak 3 languages fluently, right? So, we got to get over that. So we're on a path to reconciliation. It starts with you, and it starts with us working all collectively and having accountability for getting there in some way. We got 37 million people in Canada. If every person just took one little piece of achieving reconciliation, we'd get there a lot faster.
Okay, well, very powerful stories, Hope. And I feel privileged to work with you on this. And we've opened it for questions. People, the easiest is if you put questions in the chat area, I think is helpful.
I can't see the chat area.
I can relate them over to you.
Okay, thanks.
And I also wanted to, thinking about your role that you've had over these 30 years, really on the front lines, and as you said, something that definitely seems to be accelerating is the recognition and engagement, in a way, within the business community, within First Nations, in partnerships and working together, and in different forms of, and sometimes difficult relationships that have emerged. But you've been working on many of these difficult projects. And I just thought maybe hear a bit of your perspective on the role that business and these partnerships, or some of the projects that you've seen in reconciliation and in that process, in economic reconciliation and creating equality of opportunity for people.
Yeah, that's a big one. And I think we see different sectors approaching it differently. So I think you see mining and oil and gas, particularly in pipelines, because pipelines are linear projects and they traverse so many territories. I think you start, and they're big, generally pipeline companies are bigger companies. I think you're starting to see a lot more acknowledgement and interpretation and application of reconciliation in their organizations. And I think the good organizations are doing that in partnership with the nations that they work with, to define what reconciliation will mean in their relationship and in their partnerships. And I think, in the old days, when I first started working in pipelines in 1991, we would sometimes notify people that we were going to be in the area, to now it's, you need permission. And in order to achieve permission, and sometimes it's not just the social acceptability, it's legal and regulatory approval. In order to get there, It's got to be equal just on every level, and that includes economic. You want to work in our territory? Again, the message was put your money where your mouth is, because you're leaving this more prosperous once this pipeline is in the ground and once this mine is operating. And we too, as a nation, wherever that nation happens to be, whether it's the Métis Nation, whether it's the Stolo, whether it's the Nlakapa, whether it's Wet'suwet'en, we too will prosper from this. And more importantly, what I've experienced is communities and nations not only want to prosper and participate in it, they want to direct it, they want to manage it, they want to own it, they want to control it to some degree, either in partnership or on their own. And we're starting to see that. I think you'll see that Trans Mountain will be partially, to some degree, owned by Indigenous peoples down the road. And you're starting to see that with many other projects, some of the mining projects. So we've gone from, I actually have a little diagram that I use in some of my PowerPoints. We've gone from notification to regulation and everything in between. And it really is about asserting control and involvement and Indigenous governance over others' presence on their land. And leveling that playing field.
Do you see question and discussion that's come up in the context? So there has been the place, and then you yourself worked on Indigenous relations for some of the organizations that you worked with. And there seems to be often, wow, we'll hire some Indigenous people to work in the Indigenous relations area, but there seemed to be a segregation or a separation of how companies see Indigenous employees in many cases. And do you see that evolving and breaking down, and that more opportunities? And there's a question about, for young Indigenous people, the opportunities that are available.
I think that there's, so having been an Indigenous person working in Indigenous relations, there's also been times where I haven't worked in Indigenous relations. When I was the CEO of the RCMP Foundation, I ran the entire organization. We had 5 lines of business. I think there was an added benefit that I brought to helping them engage with Indigenous communities. I've worked in government relations, I've worked in land, I've worked in environment, I've worked in emergency response. But there is that trap that Indigenous people can get into. They are attracted to an organization or are attracted to an organization to help with Indigenous relations, but let's not pigeonhole them there. And I think what we'll see is we're seeing a lot more educated Indigenous people coming out of post-secondary education institutions these days. Nowhere near the numbers that we need, for sure. But as we start to diversify our skill sets that could serve industry and government and nonprofit, we won't get pigeonholed into those careers or be held there. But it's going to take time, and it's going to take us all working, and I say us, Indigenous peoples, working really hard and demonstrating our value in these organizations. And really, and there's things in Canada that help with that as well, but they need to happen more. Things like the Inspire Awards, which showcase Indigenous talent across this country, whether they have to be maxillofacial surgeons or filmmakers in Hollywood or whatever. We have the capacity to do anything and everything we want to be. We need to get into these organizations, and we need not to get pigeonholed. And I think organizations are starting to recognize, and there is even actual federal employment equity legislation that says if you're a federally regulated company, you need to have Indigenous people, and I'll just use Indigenous, but the minorities and other at-risk groups in all levels in your organization and across the organization. You can't have all Indigenous people in Indigenous relations, and you need to have them in other occupations. You need to have them at multiple levels. We're not seeing enough Indigenous people in the boardroom. We're not seeing enough Indigenous people in executive roles. And there's been a lot of media around that in the last 4 or 5 years. And I think that we're starting to shatter some ceilings. We're starting to push boundaries, but it's going to take time. And again, that's, one of the calls to action is getting more Indigenous people educated and putting more funding into post-secondary education. Right now, I have friends who are First Nations. Their kids are struggling to get funding, right, from their reserves, because the reserves just don't get enough money per capita to run their organizations and their communities, let alone, try and get more kids into post-secondary education.
And do you see Indigenous owned, you mentioned Indigenous owned businesses and Indigenous owned, in many cases, very large enterprises, and both coming out of bans, I guess, and other opportunities that people have developed. How do you see that playing a role?
Access to capital for Indigenous communities is incredibly difficult, really, really difficult. And so it does have to have, I think, some government impetus. I mean, I remember when Chief Sophie Pierre was trying to build the hotel on the reserve at Akam, and she said she went to 5 or 6 banks, right? No one would back her, no one. And so access to capital is probably the biggest issue in leveling the economic playing field. And so you're starting to see a lot more conglomeration in economic development bodies between nations. So there's 3 or 4 major groups that are vying to become, partial owners, if not in whole, of the Trans Mountain Project. And I think we started to see some of that a little bit with Gateway, had it moved forward as well. And it is probably the principal barrier. The reason I chose water as my research topic and my PhD, folks were saying you should look at the ECDEV piece, particularly of Gateway. And I said, if people don't have access to safe drinking water, their aspirations are limited. How can I get to school if I can't bathe in clean water and I can't drink clean water? How can I get a post-secondary education? How can we get enough money and access to capital when I'm just worried about getting water to people? And so I think there's, on so many different levels, reconciliation is taking a different trajectory. And I think it depends on the capacity of the nations. So there does have to be some in government incentivization for and assistance and help. I mean, let's face it, the government is funding First Nations in many different ways. I think there needs to be more room and more opportunity for funding of economic development, true economic development, access to capital, and it needs to be new and creative ways of getting access to capital to really start to level that playing field.
Yeah, that's an interesting insight, something that we should think about and explore, because there's a lot of opportunities as well.
I'd like to see, maybe this is some of the work we could do, Charles. I'd like to see what the Indigenous contribution is to GDP in this country right now. And set that as a benchmark, and where do we go from here? Where we end up in 5 years?
Yeah, I know Caroline Hilton and some of her work with Indigenomics has been looking at some things like that. So maybe that's something we can bring into the conversation.
Yeah.
Imara is reminding me we are coming to the top of the hour, and we respect everyone's time. You send us some information that we can send out. You should definitely look. There are many people talking about what a powerful story you have, and they really appreciate your insights. So you should look at the chat. And
I can't see it.
I can take a copy of the chat and share it out with you, Hope, after, because there's some really great dialogue happening that
okay, I just want to point out to people the cart that is the background on my visual is the Métis Red River cart, and so there's a reference to that as well. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for allowing me to share my ideas and thoughts with you. It was very, very I feel very blessed to have done this today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And we will be following up, and we have another event, Insights for Action event coming up in a month. And I'm sure this is a topic that we will circle back to in many different ways. And maybe you can join us again, Hope.
I'd love to. As we say in Cree, Eexemaga.
We'll be working together, and there's much more to learn here. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.